Chapter 18, Friday, June 28th, 1776. Received information that a most horrid plot was on foot by the vile Tories of this place to assassinate His Excellency and the other general officers, blow up the gunpowder magazine, spike the cannon, etc. Hope they will receive the punishment due such infamous wretches. Journal of Samuel B. Webb, Washington's aide de camp. Shortly after the clock struck 10 on Friday morning, thousands of boots echoed against the cobblestones of Broadway. Every soldier in New York was marching up Island to attend the hanging of Thomas Hickey, the man who almost assassinated General George Washington. Becky urged me to go. There's nothing like a good hanging, is there? She gave the face of the grandfather clock another swipe with the dust rag. Keep an eye on your sister, though. Little ones disappear in big crowds. What about Madame? I asked. Nothing to worry about there, eh? Becky pointed upstairs, where Madame lay atop the coverlet on her bed, asleep. She had stayed muddy in strong wine since Lockton fled the city. The thought of a hanging turned my belly, but Colonel Reagan would likely be there. Perhaps he would provide an escort for Ruth and me direct from the gallows to the wharf. Go on, Becky said again. It'll be good for you to get some air. Fetch a bucket of water home with you, mind. I wager Madame will wake up with a thumping headache. Ruth and I found ourselves in a tide of people moving north. The wave spread out once it reached the commons, where the prison, the barracks, and a large sugar house stood. Beyond the hills to the north lay the African burial ground, and beyond that a big pond called the Collect. This was the one spot in the city where 20,000 folk could gather. I could scarce credit the number, but it was on everyone's lips. Ruth watched the crowd with big eyes and shy smiles for strangers, but she did not release my hand and kept her doll baby clutched tight to her. I half expected to see vendors selling cinnamon water, boiled sweets, and currant cakes, and a conjure man who could juggle two balls and a stool. There were none in sight, but the air of high spirits made it feel like a fair day. I took Ruth by the hand and led her around the backside of Bridwell Prison towards the tea-water pump, where there were other slaves and servants gathered. I nodded polite and murmured my good day to the old man we called grandfather and the others who were familiar. Ruth sat in the dust. I turned our bucket upside down, sat on it, pulled a length of string from my pocket, and wove it into a fanciful pattern around my fingers. Cratch cradle, Ruth said, clapping her hands. We lost ourselves in play, our fingers making candles, triangles, diamonds, and the manger. Suddenly, there came a rough shout from the center of the commons. The crowd muttered, some folks craning their necks to see. Ruth giggled and held out her hand to me. She had made a complete mismatch of the string and could not untangle her fingers from the knot. There came another shout. Then the drummers started beating their snares. The noise crackled like lightning. Game's over, I said to Ruth, freeing my hands and pulling her to her feet. The crowd surrounding the commons had swelled to include the entire army and every soul in the city except for Madame and Becky. I scanned the rows of officers lined up behind the gallows, looking for Colonel Reagan. I could pick out General Washington astride his big gray horse at the center of the line. Next to him was a rather large figure of Colonel Knox and countless other officers I could not name. Colonel Reagan was not to be seen, but he could have been rows to the back. Blast! I should have realized they would be in formation, not scattered amongst the common folk. Another shout order echoed off the stone from the prison. Near 100 soldiers stepped out of ranks and snapped to attention. The bayonets fixed to the end of their long muskets flashed in the sun. The drummers continued beating, sweat trickling down their faces. Bet you never saw this out in the country, a familiar voice said in my ear. I whirled with a gasp. Curzon laughed at my astonishment. Missed me? He asked. What are you doing here? Where have you been? I asked, fighting to keep my voice low. Much is afoot. He nodded his head towards the gallows. So I see. I opened my mouth to ask first of 1,000 questions, but he quickly put a finger to his lips. Shh, he warned. Ruth put her arms in the air and grunted. She was tired at staring at the backsides of people crowding around us. I shook my head. You're too big to pick up. No, she's not. Before I could protest, Curzon tossed his ridiculous hat at me and lifted Ruth up to the perch on his left shoulder. She squealed with delight and a little fear and hung onto his neck so tightly he looked to choke. I glanced at the red fabric in my hands. A name was written on a scrap of fabric affixed to the crown. James. James? I wondered aloud. If he heard me, Curzon took no notice. His eyes raked the crowd, looking intently but giving no clue about what he sought. I cupped my hands to my mouth and whispered in his ears, "When will they send for Ruth and me? Colonel Reagan promised to help." "The world turns upside down every day." He kept his eyes straight ahead and one hand on Ruth's back to hold her steady. "The time will come, you'll see." The drums beat faster. My heart sped up to match the rhythms. The drums stopped. "Here he comes," someone called. A guard marched Hickey out of the prison and across the yard to the gallows, his uniform dirty but buttoned. He kept his eyes on the steps that led up to the platform. He did not look at the rope that awaited him. The crowd had recovered its voice and was screaming vile curses. Cabbages, rotten apples, and a dead cat were thrown in the direction of the traitor. He flinched as an egg sailed past his nose, but the men holding his elbows kept their backs straight and their boots marching forward. Hickey was halted in front of the captain of the guard. The captain said something we couldn't hear, then pulled the sword from his scabbard and sliced the epaulets off Hickey's shoulders. He folded them and placed them in his pocket. Then he brought the sword down in a sweep across the front of Hickey's chest, neatly slicing off the buttons from the traitor's coat. The buttons fell one by one into the dust. Ruth stopped giggling. A preacher stepped out of the crowd and approached Hickey, a Bible in his hand. The captain nodded curtly at the preacher and said something else to Hickey again, too low for us to hear. Hickey said nothing, but he had started to tremble. The captain spat on Hickey's boots, took one step back, and slid his sword home into the scabbard. The preacher murmured to Hickey and got no response, so took him by the hand and led him to the wooden stairs that led up to his fate. "He's crying," I said. "Good," Curzon said. When he got to the top of the steps, Hickey turned, and so the hangman could bind his wrists behind him. The drummers started beating their snares again, louder than before. The aide on horseback next to General Washington spoke, and the general leaned forward to hear better. He was by far the tallest man in sight. He agreed with whatever the aide said and patted his horse's neck. The animal tossed his mane and pawed at the ground. The crowd had grown so loud that Ruth released Curzon's neck and covered her ears with her hands. She whimpered once. I held out my arms and she slid into them. I lowered her to the ground. She stood near on top of my shoes, grasped my apron, and stuck her thumb in her mouth. The hangman led Hickey to the center of the platform. He placed the knotted noose around Hickey's neck, tightened it, then helped him climb onto an upright barrel. The captain of the guard raised his hand. The drumming stopped. The crowd fell silent. The captain of the guard unrolled a sheet of paper and read the charges in a loud voice. "Thomas Hickey, you have been court-martialed and found guilty of the capital crimes of mutiny and sedition, of holding a treacherous correspondence with and receiving pay from the enemy for the most horrid and detestable purposes, and you have been sentenced to hang from the neck until dead. You are a disgrace to your country." He rolled the paper back. May God have mercy on your soul." With that pronouncement, the hangman kicked the barrel away. The crowd gasped. I covered Ruth's eyes with my own, and closed my own. Chapter 19. Sunday, June 30th through Monday, July 1st, 1776. Sir, we have been too long deaf. We have too long shown our forbearance and long suffering. Our thunders must go forth. America must be conquered. Alexander Wedderburn, Solicitor General of England, to George III, King of England. Most heartily we beseech thee, with thy favour, to behold our most gracious sovereign lord, King George, and to replenish him with the grace of thy Holy Spirit. The minister paused to draw breath. And bless our gracious Queen Charlotte, their Royal Highnesses George, Prince of Wales, the Princess Dowager of Wales, and all of the royal family. The Reverend had so much beseeching to do for the royal family, I thought we'd be stuck in church for a week. Trinity was an Anglican church, filled with the prayers for England, burning incense, and ministers in fancy dress. It discommoded me some to attend, but Madam gave me no choice. At home, we went to the Congregational Church, with 10 pews, windows that look out to the ocean, and a preacher who always wore black. I liked it better. Incense made me sneeze. We humbly beseech. They did a pack of beseeching at Trinity. The church was more than half empty compared to the first Sunday Madam brought us, what with so many folks melting into the countryside, like Master Lockton. Martha Washington and her ladies were north on the island, and those left in the pews were loyalists. This made matters easier for the Reverend, who could pray the way he wanted without worry of insulting men who owned the rebel cannons. Ruth bounced her cornhusk doll on her lap and flew it through the air. Some folks grumbled about servants and slaves being forced to sit in the upstairs gallery. To my mind, being in the upstairs meant we were closer to God, and our prayers got there first. Besides, nobody upstairs fussed when Ruth played on the floor. Light in our darkness, we beseech thee, O Lord, and by thy great mercy defend us from all perils and dangers. I beseech thee, O Lord, by thy great mercy, take us home. By the hand of Colonel Reagan, take us home. In all thy glory, take us home. Ad astra, ad astra, ad astra. Ruth tugged on my skirt. It was time to stand up again and pray. Below us, Madame leaned against the sturdy figure of Lady Seymour, who had come to the house early and forced Madame out of bed and into a Sunday dress. She covered the bruises still visible on Madame's face with a thick white layer of Molyneux's Italian paste, and told her she must not show weakness. We sat down again, up, down, up, down. Yon minister could never make up his mind. My belly grumbled. Good thing the service was drawing to a close. Just a little more beseeching, a few amens, and we'd be home for cold pigeon pie and sour pickles. Ruth's fingers drifted to her nose for some unsightly digging. As I reached for her hand, the front door of the church slammed open with a thud. The Reverend near fainted with surprise. A young boy ran halfway down the center aisle. "Begging pardon, Reverend," he shouted, "but the British have sailed into the harbor." The British Army was hardly marching down Wall Street, but 10 ships had docked downriver on Staten Island. Ruth and me followed behind Madame and Lady Seymour as we strode with the crowd to the battery as fast as our skirts would allow. Madame quivered with excitement, but was wise enough not to say a word, for we found ourselves in a crowd of rebels furious about the arrival of King George's boys. Someone fired a cannon a stone's throw from where we stood. A gunpowder smoke drifted across the crowd as soldiers started running every which way, carrying on about orders this and orders that. Someone fired a musket and a woman shrieked. 2 more muskets blasted. Rough voices commanded the firing to cease. Mothers chased after their children. 5 men in frontier leggings and leather shirts sprinted past us, rifles at the ready. Should I grab Ruth and run for the barracks? Could we slip away to the sanctuary in the commotion? I looked for Colonel Reagan, but saw him not. None of the men were familiar to me. Had I waited too long? The cannons fired once more, then fell silent. The ships were too far away to be hit, and the cannonballs fell into the river. Another musket cracked fire, but this was more distant. The crowd had settled some, and the soldiers were lining up in orderly fashion thanks to their barking officers. "Everyone please disperse," shouted a broad-shouldered man in a crisp blue coat and a sleek, freshly powdered wig. "There is no danger here. Go about your business." "Come now," Madame said. "We'll leave this rabble." She walked away with Lady Seymour. I went to follow them, but Ruth would not move. She stood rooted to the ground, trembling against my leg as if a gale were blowing. "Ruthie," I patted her back. "It's over now. The noise is gone. No more bangs." I reached to pry her fingers from me. They were stiff and shaking. She was in the grip of a fit, a small one. "O Lord, I beseech thee." Madame had stopped and was watching us. "Come along, girl," she snapped. "Turn your sister loose and run ahead to prepare the meal." Ruth quivered, her teeth chattering in her head. "She's a wee bit frightened, ma'am," I explained. "Never heard a cannon go off before." "Neither have I," added Lady Seymour. "She'll feel better once she starts to walk." "Please, Lord." "Hear what Mrs. said, Ruth? Walking is the best thing. Please keep her on her feet. Please make it stop. We've work to do, baby girl." My voice was as false as my smile. "Please." I stepped forward, pushing Ruth ahead as I went. The trembling stopped, but her body went limp. I picked her up and settled her on my hip, her head on my shoulder as if she had fallen asleep. Lady Seymour frowned in concern. "Is she poorly?" Madame cast a suspicious eye on us. "No, ma'am," I lied, "just tired." "She's not suffering her particular ailment, is she?" Madame asked, her voice cutting like a blade. "No, ma'am," I lied again. "She helped carry out the ashes this morning, and it tired her." Madame glared a moment longer. Lady Seymour stepped in front of Madame. "The heat affects small children more than most. Make sure your sister drinks some water before any more chores." "Yes, ma'am. Thank you, ma'am." I bobbed a clumsy curtsy and walked as fast as I could with the limp burden in my arms, beseeching with every step. British ships continued to sail upriver all day and all night. Madam set us to polishing the silver in hopes that we might soon be serving dinner to the British High Command. On Monday morning, Becky sent me to the washerwoman with a giant basket of dirty tablecloths and servettes. So many ships had arrived by then, hundreds, folks said, with thousands of soldiers, that we could see the patches of white sail far down the harbor. The washerwoman's home stood empty. A neighbor said she had fled at first light, terrified at the thought of invasion. She wasn't the only one. I carried the basket of linen back to the house on Wall Street, put a pot of water over the fire, and gathered the soap and scrubbing board. Becky was off in search of a seamstress, so Ruth helped me haul the water to the washtub in the backyard. I gave her a small bucket and a sliver of soap, and she got to work washing a pair of stockings and singing to herself. She showed no ill effect of the small fit at the battery. It had been a brief shower, not a thunderstorm. As I scrubbed, my mind ran in circles like a dog chasing its tail. I should take Ruth and march down to the battery. I should demand payment for helping with the arrests. No, no demands. I should politely ask the colonel to fulfill his promise as a gentleman would. I should write a letter to the general. I should beg Curzon, to beg Mr. Bellingham, to beg whoever to get us out. I flopped the tablecloth into the rinse tub and started in on a shift that had gotten mixed in with the table linens. Ruth dropped her stockings in the rinse bucket and loaded her bucket with rocks. We don't wash rocks, Ruth, I explained. But they dirty, she said. That is the truth, I said. The rocks were dirty, and washing them kept her calm and away from Madam. Scrub away, lass. There was no use in begging anyone. The chances of them listening to me were as good as a snowball's chance in the devil's bake oven. I reached for the soap as Ruth flung her half-washed rocks, now muddy, not dirty, into the rinsing tub with the clean tablecloth. Before I could scold her, the back door slammed. I saw the flash of a yellow gown by the kitchen window. Madam had been watching us, no doubt displeased that Ruth was washing rocks with the tablecloths. We must escape soon.